feel free to shift around in your place so you can see better. And people managing to get outside a little bit. See a number of people opted to be outside this morning. It's a delight. And who all came for the Taiko presentation yesterday? It was really fun. There was maybe close to 100 people in the backyard. Does that seem about right to people? A lot of humans here. So Jiko and Joichi organized to get a group from the Club Taiko program from the University of Oregon to come and give a presentation. So it was really, really special. And I left for the workshop portion of it, but I could hear it going about a mile away. So sort of self-advertising as I was in a park over yonder, just don and start moving my body a bit. So really, really fun time. So this morning, I'd like to talk about Zazen practice. This form, we call it a practice, this method that is so central to this tradition. And so, on that note, how was it for you all this morning? And really, let's go for it. Like from 1 to 10, if you're willing to show some fingers. Honestly, mine was about a 2. Anyone willing? Got 4 people. Got some 8s, 7s. Great. So how playful and silly does that feel? And for many people who've been practicing here for a long time, it also probably feels a bit heretical, at least awkward. Because what's so often emphasized is another aspect of encountering mind in meditation practice in particular, but actually the whole quality of our life. That there's a 10 out of 10 that's always present somehow. There's a mystery there, and something that doesn't quite match with our experience. But it was there from the inception of our path when the Buddha woke up under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago. I, together with all beings in the great earth, attained to the way at one time. I, this being, this Buddha being, all beings, great earth. That's a phraseology for everything, every little speck, included in this awakening at a time beyond time. And yet, I rocked a 2 this morning, you know? And so it sets up a central conundrum for our practice, a central steepening and deepening of our understanding as we walk the path. And it brings forward questions. So do I just get used to being schlocky? Is that the path? Maybe there's something in there, but that can't be all of it. Do I take it as a project to perfect every aspect of my character, to get to 10 out of 10? Well, that sounds heroic, but also sounds like a recipe for brutality and rigidity. And if it is about perfection of character, how is that really accomplished? What can that look like? Is it an exercise? Doing the reps? Is it like love? And what's that? Yeah. Love sometimes is like a sword. We have to be brutal and honest with our loved ones at times in a way that's challenging. Or is it like a flower? Opening. And will I see it or know it if I'm actually doing it? Right? These are the questions that are presented to us when we take up the posture of Zazen and we meet our schlocky selves day after day. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a teaching called the Jiji Zanmai. It was written by a Soto Zen priest about 300 years after Dogen lived. His name is Menzan Zuiho. He was quite a revivalist and beloved priest in our school. So he says, in this Jiji Zanmai, it translates that title means something like the concentration of self, receiving and employing self. The concentration of self, receiving and employing self. sort of mysterious, evocative title. So he says in here, but there's a path through which the perfect awakened reality of all things returns to the person in Zazen, and whereby that person and the enlightenment of all things intimately and imperceptibly assist each other. Therefore, this person in Zazen without fail drops off body and mind, cuts away previous tainted views and thoughts, awakens genuine Buddha Dharma, universally helps the Buddha work in each place, as numerous as atoms, where Buddha Tathagatas teach and practice, and widely influences practitioners. However, these various mutual influences do not mix into the perceptions of this person sitting, because they take place within stillness without any fabrication, and they are enlightenment itself. If practice and enlightenment were separate, as people commonly believe, it would be impossible for them to perceive each other. That which is associated with perceptions cannot be the standard of enlightenment. Isn't that interesting? So much of what draws us to path is transformation, the seed of an idea, of a hope, perhaps a prayer, that the schlockiness can become 10 out of 10. And yet, he's talking here about all of these wonderful, healing, connective things that he also says you won't be able to see. They're not in the realm of our perception. These various mutual influences do not mix into the perceptions of this person sitting. So this practice of encountering our own delusion, is not separate from awakening, which is itself Dogen Zenji's fundamental teaching again and again, that practice and awakening are one. It's almost like we're left with the iceberg tip of our experience, this little bit that pops up above the water, where so much of it lives and expands into the depths. So, what do we perceive? What is experienced when we take up practice? A hint, it has to do with delusion. In Dogen Zenji, he tells us in the Genjo koan that those who greatly realize delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded in realization are living beings. So that really speaks to my experience of being a deluded living being. The next plan, a good diet, new job, new relationship, endlessly pulling the levers of our world, trying to cultivate a sense of lasting satisfaction. It's natural. It's what the mind that sees things, it's what it does. It's how it knows how to help. And in fact, we need that part of our being. How else could we have a working relationship with any other human being if we didn't judge our connection to some degree? So today's like a 3 with my child. And why is that? What's going on? How does that alert me to a greater sense and a greater ability to take care by paying direct attention to the disconnection? So this disconnection, we so often want to move past it, leap past it. And in fact, it was really challenging for me in writing this talk because I was all psyched about transformation and imagination and wondrous, pleasant delight that's possible in practice. And yet I found drawn to take care of suffering. It's so easy to leap over it. And yet our wise teachers point us back to it. So here's some more bad news from the Genjo koan. When the Dharma has not yet fully penetrated into body and mind, one thinks one is already filled with the Dharma. When the Dharma fills the body and mind, one thinks that something is lacking. One thinks that something is lacking. I think each of us knows about this feeling of lack. So why that lack? Why not a teaching that says Buddhas realize realization? Living beings are just deluded about delusion. You can see there, we're mixed up in each other. The delusion and enlightenment need each other. And perhaps some fundamental teachings that can shed more light on this, the teachings of impermanence and no self, right? Anicca and anatta in Pali. That all external things, situations, they don't stay put. It makes it hard to control the world. It makes it hard to seek a separate, safe position from the plight of all those around us. And that goes inside too. This teaching of no self that we often hear. It's also just pointing the fact that we are innumerable flows of values, views, problems, delights. That is exactly our internal realm all the time. I think I've told this story before, but there are experiments done after a person has a band of neurons that separate the left and right hemispheres of the brain. When they have that cut, there are clever ways you can talk to each hemisphere of an individual's brain separately. And so they asked one person, I think it was a young person, they said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I forget which side said which, but one side said, "I want to be a draftsman," which is like an architect. And the other side said, "I want to be a race car driver." So our being is exactly a full ecology of different perspectives and values. We're trying to navigate that day after day. So can we imagine sitting even once in our best effort application of mindfulness, of awareness, a 10 out of 10? That through our suffering, through our disorder, we are tasting directly the humbling truths that we have no abiding self, that there are no static objects that I could get. That awakening itself, I like the image that we come out of the fridge as kind of cold dough, and the warm hands of reality kneading us a little bit ruthlessly, right? Making us more pliable, more flexible, releasing in us a compassion for our own weakness that we largely are unwilling to grant ourselves in day-to-day living. So you can feel how I'm trying to avoid turning this into a sweet talk. I'm really trying to make a case for delusion. We're so often wanting to change it. And as we sit down in meditation, do you feel it yourself? That the objects, the continued fantasies and reveries of our mind, I think a very common plight in American, Western Zen, maybe Zen everywhere, maybe this is natural to human beings. We call the present moment real, and we sort of slather that real present moment on our being, and we talk ourselves out of our delusions, but we also talk ourselves out of our dreams, out of our imaginations, out of anything that doesn't strike us as real or important in a simple and narrow way. But in fact, we have to trust our desire. We have to know that it's leading us somewhere important. And so in the practice of Zazen, what could it be like to have a deep faith and trust in the lack itself? Right? The doing of not doing is so simple and so difficult to be present and engaged with, but without intention to meddle or to make satisfying. Just deep listening to our dissatisfaction. Not unlike taking care of a child or someone who just needs to be heard in our life. So there's a really beautiful image of this kind of deep connection in our hall. We sit near it all the time. We sit near them. And just to the Buddha's left over here, the statue of Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. Many of you can't see, but a wise-looking monk, totally at ease, settled, and sitting atop a rabid lion, a wild, ferocious lion. And it's a lion, but it was formed by a culture that had never seen a lion before. So it looks quite a bit like a dog, lion-dog situation, so lion or dog. For me, in my heart, in my dreams, it's often a gorilla. That's how that ferocious creature appears for me. And so you can see Manjushri, he doesn't have a spear through the lion. He's not standing victoriously over the lion. Totally connected. No gap. The 10 out of the 10, totally meeting the wild, ferocious delusion. So I am happy to say that I do believe something shifts in practice when we meet our hearts, our delusion in this way. I like to think of it as taking up a discipleship to our suffering itself. That a stomach ache cannot just be miserable, but it could also be interesting. We can feel like, oh, this isn't a good thing, but we can also question about it. We can have another part of our being fully attentive to and invested in and aware of our discomfort, the qualities that it presents us. And this is quieting. This is easy. And that a crying baby on the bus or on an airplane, right? You sit down next to a young infant. It can be really challenging for an easy, peaceful, quiet trip that you were imagining. It can be vivifying and wildly exciting to be near that crying baby. So the 10 out of 10, it can be present as our mind flits willfully here and there in a sit that feels like a 2 or 3. And so, I was totally enamored with suffering in this talk. And yet, if there was more time, gave more talks and made this a series, I'd love to talk about how actually paying attention and being burned out by our suffering is also the exact mechanism by which we can further hold joy. It's my belief anyway, that those have a direct relationship to each other, that our willingness to suffer, to meet the difficulties of our life, is directly related to our ability to leap into delight, to leap into joy and playfulness. And also in terms of talking about any kind of lasting transformation of our being, there's a beautiful saying that's used. I don't know what, we talked about this a lot in summer camp in counseling, summer camp counseling for kiddos, that no one cares what you know unless they know that you care. So you can have the best idea, the best workout plan, the best spiritual game plan for your life, but unless you are talking to the full breadth of your being, listening to all the unhappiness therein about being given a new regimen, you're never going to stick with it. If your zazen smells of brutality and trying just to make a good shape, almost inevitably, you just won't do it. You'll find excuse after excuse, and you won't even know you're making the excuses. It just simply won't take deeply in your life. And so we need this compassion, we need this tender caregiving, this caretaking, in order for any long-term changes in our lifestyle and habits that we hope to create. And so Zazen, as not seeking the real, but in fact tending and cultivating a field of delusion, be a luminous embrace. You don't get to find the real, but you get to connect with all these ways your mind is just trying to help. And you can say, oh, I see why you think that. I'm not going to do that, but I see why you're pissed off. I see why you think it'd be a great idea to flip that person off right now. Thanks. I see you. And move on. And move on. This can be a playfulness that appears in our practice, where we don't need to become rigid or moralizing, but simply attended to all the images. And from here, a subtle turning. We've become a big cauldron of delusion, churning and churning. And then you can implant just a small seed and say, what are the quiet voices that are beautiful? We know the First Noble Truth says that there's suffering. That's a part of our lot. There's nothing we can do about it. Well, there is something we can do about it. But I'm going to take the side that there's nothing we can do about it. And so simply knowing that there will be difficulty present no matter what in our life, but when we listen to all the voices, we can find quiet ones that are beautiful, that are surprising. So for me, a common instance is when I find a little bit of free time and I take up a posture of surveying my world as a kind of kingdom that I own. It's like, oh, I could do all these activities tonight. What shall I have for dinner? Shall I have a healthy night? Shall I have kind of an indulgent night? Did I buy that ice cream? There are all these different ways we imagine fulfilling ourselves. Will I read a book? Which book? Watch a movie? Do this, do this, do this? How will I make myself feel good? And if I settle a little bit, just listen, a voice says, maybe you could go for a walk. Maybe you could call your mom. Maybe you should call your mom. And they say, oh, that's beautiful. Maybe dissatisfying on one level, but so is eating a whole pizza, right? And we can take up that call for quiet beauty. But I think we can really only take up that call if we nourish a broad field of delusion and not just be seeking the real or the satisfying all the time. So I'd like to close with a short teaching poem by the great-great-uncle Dogen Zenji, Hongzhi, whom Dogen affectionately called that old Buddha. It's called The Mind-Ground Dharma Field and the Single Reed. The field of bright spirit is an ancient wilderness that does not change. With boundless eagerness, wander around this immaculate wide plain. The drifting clouds embrace the mountain. The family wind is relaxed and simple. The autumn waters display the moon in its pure brightness. Directly arriving here, you will be able to recognize the mind-ground Dharma field that is the root source of the 10,000 forms germinating with unwithered fertility. These flowers and leaves are the whole world. So we are told that a single seed is an uncultivated field. Do not weed out the new shoots, and the self will flower. And so I encourage you, as we spring into summer, enjoy all of the miraculous shoots coming up. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be open to them.
Genjo?
Mariah.
Just a note from the motherhood perspective. Could you call your mother? Should you call your mother? As a chronologically enhanced individual, just a reminder that your mother won't always be there to call. So, could you? Yes. Should you? Always. But can you? Blessing.
It's so interesting that I find like all those words, can, could, should, must, deep treasure, pain in the butt, in any of, almost I think in any of our simple trying to move through the world, all of those appear. the deep preciousness and the small being irked by it, that they're all present together. And we really need what you just said, that those heavy, beautiful aspects of our life, I think also they really guide us towards that beauty I was just mentioning. Thank you.
Genjo, sort of a reflection, not really a question or anything, but when you were speaking, your teaching reminded me very much of a very precious friend of mine who was like a world traveler, a really robust athlete. She was like I can't remember, it's like motocross, like it's like a little bicycle. She was in a very tragic accident and became paraplegic. And it was such an intense transition for her, but whenever we would meet, she began to have this relationship with her body, which was so curious. It's sort of like the lower half of her body became like objects of curiosity to her, which she could no longer feel them, but she was like, she would be like, have you ever noticed how weird knees are? Like knees, if you look really closely, are just like these bizarre things. And before she passed away, I remember she said that the soft and tender tragedy of her life was always there, even before the accident, but she needed the accident to see how true that is. Anyway, just being curious, being helped to cultivate a way of being more curious about our own, the whole thing.
Yeah,
it's really an amazing project.
Oh, thank you. Linda.
So when I first started coming here, I don't know, 6 years ago or so, one of the things I had the most trouble with was a perception that perfection was required. Okay, and I don't know whether I was projecting that or it was coming at me or something. And at that time I was working on a sort of a change in my own way of being, which replaced the goal of perfection with the goal of being good enough most of the time. And I'm wondering, is that what you're talking about?
Definitely. I think, but I would say, to maybe add a little more flesh to that, is that we need both of those perspectives. We need a perfect Buddha on the altar of our heart to call us to truly investigate as good as I can be, like reasonableness. That's my framework for that, is I say, you're not perfect, but you're reasonable. And it sets my heart at ease when I start feeling a little bit tight. And I think if we don't have some fantasies of perfection, we don't make further inquiry into what is possible in a human life. Does that make sense?
Well, it does in a way, but in a way, in some ways it frees us to expand into who, the goodness that we are naturally. Someone recently, while I was working, referred to it as, let's see, original sin, original goodness. Yeah, someone said, yeah, that was like, but yes, it seems like good enough most of the time may allow us to settle into our original goodness.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, our ideas of goodness we get caught up on so easily. I had a lovely interaction with Issei the other day where we're both feeling a little bit stressed by the yard sale. That's a natural part of the yard sale cycle. And we just had this lovely meeting where she was like, look, I can't do this alone. And I was like, look, I'm being pinched here. And we both just sort of like let out our bellies and said, yeah, this is hard. How can I support you? How can I support you? And so it took copping to our inability to hold something, realizing our limitations and sharing that to bring out the best we could be. And so if we didn't recognize and settle on that and bring that forward, we couldn't have taken this next step together. So
Which is not perfect, but good enough most of the time.
Yeah. And maybe it is. That's how, maybe as perfect as a community as we can get requires humans just acknowledging their limitations and relying on each other. That this is a kind of perception that goes beyond needing to be a simplistic, narrow idea of a perfect individual. We could have perfect reliance and perfect sincerity with our limitations. That this is another gate of exploration for a kind of perfect that we usually don't imagine as viable or possible or helpful.
Genjo. So I've spent a good chunk of my life recently seemingly on my own, and I'm discovering the usefulness of community and people and closeness to allow for this reflection of my own limitations to come to light. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
I loved how you, what you phrased it as, seemingly alone. It was very, yeah, it's nice. I think you just said it perfectly, that somehow our world just tends to lock up around us, especially when we're left to our own devices, that this part of our brain that wants to take up a static, knowing view of the world just churns forward and draws circles and circles and circles, and we don't even know that that circle is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We just see the circle as the same size, but actually it's spiraling into a kind of tightness. And so the emphasis on community and a raw meeting and trying to do things together with other people is going to call you to the fact when your circle's too small. Which yesterday, hilariously, it was for me. I was a little bit stressed about this Dharma talk. It had all fallen apart from where I wanted to go. And I told Susan and Sophia that I was like, I don't think I'm going to go to the Taiko presentation. And they were just like, what, are you nuts? And I was like, well, I need to be alone to do this Dharma talk, and I need to cultivate this kind of silence. And they just kind of looked at me and they're like, you should probably really stay. And then they just left. And I was totally called out, and I almost took what felt like the high road to me. I almost took the high road of, I need to go do the noble alone thing, and then I can give the good Dharma talk for the community. And then I smelled it. I just smelled my bullshit. It was just seeping through everything, and I was like, oh, you're full of shit. You're just full of it. And so I just copped to it and had an amazing time, and Susan was exactly right, that design happens by encountering a lively world, and we merge with it with our drawing circles. There's something of our discriminating mind that knows qualities and has ideas that meets with the unfathomable connection of the world. And that's how something brilliant, new, and enlivening can make its way in. If you lean on one or the other, I think you'll fall off track, but bringing those together allows fresh life to come forward. Tojun? Can't hear you yet.
Hear me now?
Yes.
I just unmuted myself, yeah. Thank you so much for your Dharma talk today. I think you really kind of married all the smelliness and the beauty and all of that. Anyway, I was hoping that you might relate this Dharma talk a little bit to the paramita forbearance, patience, in terms of, in any terms you choose, but it just seems to me that in that stopgap of just checking in and of just taking that breath, and sometimes we can dislodge some of these habitual reactive reactions and things like that. But however it speaks to you, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that.
Yeah. As you were talking, it feels like patience really is the underlying thread in this whole talk. And I think that what's interesting about the perfection of patience is that the phenomenal front side of patience is just difficulty. Like really that the word we use there for patience, also a translation of that is forbearance. Just to forbear. And it's pretty unsexy teaching in some ways. We really want more. And what comes to me when you ask that, and it marries what Matthew was just talking about, is for me, I don't know if, actually, no, I do know. I know I couldn't be who I am now in many parts of myself that I really appreciate and what I'm able to offer the world in ways that I never thought possible. I wouldn't be able to be who I am without a community that gave me some kind of courage to just return to sitting meditation hour after hour. That it took having a teacher, it took having bodies next to me on the cushion coming back, because everything I reached for couldn't give me the courage to do it. But outside of me, other humans doing that allowed me to come back. It was a blessing from outside that I had to rely on. And so that feels like an important part to place in this conversation, that we have to rely on each other. And there should be a point where you find the end of your rope. That will likely be a mark that practice is really flowing in your life. And that can have a dangerous feeling side, which means immediately reach out to someone. A scary side, something feels really broken. Or just like a infuriating chomping that you don't know what to do with, and you're at the end of your rope. And rely on the forms of a community. Just go. Ask questions in the places that that's offered. Find an excuse to keep going back, even if it's just the cookies and coffee, that just sticking with it and not needing to have a grander vision is really important.
I guess what just came up for me when you said that also, refuge, taking refuge in the Sangha, and then with forbearance and patience, but then also in the Buddha and the Dharma also, and in the relation to the to your Dharma talk as well. So, gotcha.
Time for one more, if anyone's interested. Well, we could fit two, I think. Koshin and Doki.
I appreciated your notion of the strong talking minds, but there's also that quiet other voice in there that if I can really tune in, I can listen to. Because the strong talking mind is so loud and persistent, and it overshadowing that quiet voice more often than not. Do you have any practical advice, whether it's in sitting or sitting quietly between appointments or whatever, to turn the knob more toward the quiet voice when that's not the habit?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Favorite prescription, dharmic prescription I'm giving people who are having practice discussions with is to lay on your face on the ground for 7 minutes when you have an opportunity. It's really, I find it still, I get so trapped by my idea of being a person who does Zen, or being a Buddhist. I'd be like, oh, well, I'll sit the meditation. And it's this tight little complex. And of course, actually, if I end up sitting, oftentimes that falls away pretty quickly. It's like, oh yeah, that's the liveliness of this. But also there's something beautiful when you take up the prone posture of death on the ground. And I think a key point that I'd like to offer in what you're saying is that so often we think that we can quiet the voices or that they become quiet. But I find that more if I really allow and listen to and entertain the deluding, the constant deluding and the images and where those loud voices want to go. And I say, oh, maybe and I think about it, and then I say, I feel it, but I really give them the airtime, then actually the quiet voices appear of themselves. But I think if we try and just quiet the voices, we end up smothering everything in a way, where we then just pick kind of a simplistic solution to make our next choice. So you can lay on the floor between appointments. Might be awkward if someone comes in a little late, but it's really a delight. And I almost laugh every time I do it, especially if you do it in a particularly uncomfortable position, like laying totally flat. It's a ridiculous position for a human being. Releases a little bit of levity if you're feeling a bit tight. So if you're feeling inspired. And Dokyu, you finish this out?
Yeah, so I was curious about the image of Manjushri on the lion dog, and when I imagine a meeting, like I notice Manjushri's on top of him, on top of the dog, and you could see like how he could be riding him and they're working together, I guess. But like when I think of a meeting, I think of more like playing together, maybe, or like he'd be rubbing his belly. I don't know. So I don't know if you could speak to like, what is the relationship of meeting our delusion, and like, is there a place for the top down, or how do you see that image?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really necessary for us to want to wake up and to honor that even that is a kind of delusion, right? And one that we charge with a certain kind of beauty and importance, and we know that waking up isn't going to be the quality of what we think it is. And yet, that's also the exact reason why we put a Buddha on a high altar. That we say, I don't know what this is, but I value it, and I know that every idea I have about it won't be what I want it to be. But somehow, I need to make space for that beautiful delusion to encourage me to go beyond. So I think maybe that's one just imagistic reason that Manjushri is on top of the lion dog. But I think you're exactly right that what this kind of playful imagining opens up and thinking about this imagery is that it's a dance of Manjushri and the lion. And that maybe phenomenally, when we just kind of what we really experience on the path, sometimes we have the experience of being Manjushri. I mean, it's really possible, and it's good to talk about this sometimes, that to be firmly connected with your wild mind, but not experiencing difficulty at the same time. That each new, wild idea is the new center of a beautiful flower, endlessly blooming. That this is possible. And other times, we're just the mad dog. Manjushri is off getting a hamburger somewhere, and the wild dog is roaming wild. But in fact, I think these teachings also present us with the truth that either way, both aspects are present, but we'll tend to think that they're not. And so part of our practice is constantly remembering they're in dialogue, they're in harmony, they're in play together.
This and all our teachings are offered free of charge. If you would like to make a donation, please visit our website at buddhaeye.org and click the donate button at the top of the page. Thanks.